Hello, education students, and welcome to this explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here. Today, we're taking all those vital objectives, the data, and those critical thinking concepts from your course materials, and we're transforming Chapter 3 into a really clear, highly visual study guide. We're going to look specifically at U.S. history and the foundational laws affecting young children with exceptionalities. By the time we wrap up this explainer, you're going to have a deep, structured understanding of exactly how our education system arrived where it is today. Let's get right into it. Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. First, the evolution of education. Second, confronting a dark history. Third, laws protecting exceptional children. And finally, gifted and talented programs. So, starting off with Section 1, the evolution of education, from the early colonies to the space race. If we go way back to the early colonies, schools were exclusively for wealthy families. Education was a luxury, definitely not a right. But then fast forward to World War II, and we see this massive shift driven by national need. Parents working in the war effort shipyards actually received free, quality childcare for their kids, which is huge. Then came the truly monumental year of 1954. This is when the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution served as the crucial legal basis for the decision declaring school segregation unconstitutional. And then, just 3 years later in 1957, Russia launched Sputnik. Well, this event caused absolute panic among American leaders. It completely spurred the federal government into making radical changes, massively increasing their support of local public schools, just so we could keep up on the global stage. That whole timeline brings us to a really important critical thinking question directly from your chapter objectives. What exactly was the motivation for creating programs like Head Start? Well, think about the progressive education goals championed by figures like John Dewey. Dewey profoundly impacted American public schools with his vision of inclusive, democratic classrooms. The overarching goal was always to provide a foundational launchpad for all children, absolutely regardless of their background. But here is the reality check, and this perfectly illustrates the gap between those lofty historical goals and our modern system. Despite massive federal initiatives like Head Start, the hard truth from your chapter data is that today, quality, affordable childcare for working families is absolutely not readily available to all Americans. Furthermore, for the most part, early childhood programs remain highly segregated. We're talking both racially and by income. It's just a stark reminder that the progressive goals of the past are very much still a work in progress today. Moving right along to Section 2, confronting a dark history, focusing on eugenics and segregation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is a tool we often completely take for granted today, the IQ assessment of intelligence. This actually marked the very beginning of the eugenics movement in the United States. This was an incredibly dark period that relied heavily on a fabricated racial hierarchy. And this hierarchy was designed by European scientists specifically to explain supposed racial differences and falsely justify white superiority. The real-world impacts of this movement were just devastating and completely far-reaching. Not only was the eugenics movement weaponized to justify those false racial differences in educational settings, but its insidious logic actually bled into broader government policy. Your chapter data points out a deeply unsettling fact. The eugenics movement was even used, in part, to justify the forced internment of Japanese citizens during World War II. Think about that for a second. This is exactly why understanding the historical roots of our educational assessment tools is absolutely vital. Thankfully, our understanding of human capability has evolved significantly past those narrow, discriminatory early IQ tests. A monumental pivot in educational psychology was Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, which recognizes 8 distinct learning styles. So, instead of a single rigid metric of intelligence, this framework acknowledges that exceptional children, and honestly all children, process information and demonstrate their brilliance in vastly different ways. That brings us to Section 3, Laws Protecting Exceptional Children, looking at advocacy and modern legal frameworks. To really appreciate the laws we have today, we kind of have to look back at a pretty stark reality. Before the late 1900s, children in the United States who had disabilities were simply not integrated. They were completely isolated from their typically developing peers, often literally hidden away in separate classrooms. They were not fully protected by the government, and they certainly weren't experiencing those inclusive classrooms that John Dewey had dreamed of.
So, how did things finally change? Well, it wasn't just politicians waking up one day and deciding to fix the system. It was grassroots advocacy. Parents of students with disabilities and delays were absolutely instrumental in the passage of the first nationwide civil rights law for students with disabilities. So, the crucial point is that it was their relentless push that ultimately forced the federal government to act.
And that amazing advocacy led to the foundational laws you absolutely must know as an educator. On one side, we have IDEA. Specifically, Part B of IDEA is designed to cover individuals from 3 to 21 years old. Now, on the other side, we have Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. What you really need to remember about Section 504 is that it is legally broader than IDEA. It casts a much wider net to prevent discrimination, which really makes both of these laws vital, overlapping shields for your students. Let's transition into our final part, Section 4, Gifted and Talented Programs and the Complex Landscape of GT Education. Let's look at the actual factors shaping GT programs in public schools today. Because unlike some of the sweeping federal mandates we just discussed, GT education is primarily directed and implemented by the state education authority and local schools. In fact, these programs are heavily impacted by a distinct lack of federal oversight and legislation. They're swayed by broader federal laws like No Child Left Behind and, of course, local decision-making. Now, a very common misconception is that GT programs fail because families just aren't interested. But your chapter data specifically debunks this. A lack of interest by families of GT students is absolutely not what is impacting these programs. It's fundamentally a structural and legislative issue. Wow, we've covered some immense ground today, from colonial inequalities and the dark shadows of eugenics, all the way to the parent-led victories of IDEA and the localized complexities of GT programs. Which really leaves us with a final provocative question. Knowing all of this, and knowing that early childhood programs are still largely unintegrated today, how will you advocate for the exceptional learners in your future classroom? You now have the historical context and the legal understanding to be a true champion for every single student. Keep that question in the back of your mind as you continue your studies. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep up the fantastic work.